So I'm going to do the review for American society. So I've already done this once today, so just bear with me because I might be running out of voice after teaching all day and then doing this review at lunch. You should have review number 5 in front of you, okay? We've got 5 today, 6 is the causes, and then there's 2 more next week, and then we're done, okay, with the reviews. Today is American society. In case you guys haven't figured this out yet, pretty much everything up to this point has been political, history, military history. Well, this is the first time that we kind of venture into social and cultural and a little bit of economic history too. That's the theme of American society, antebellum, right? Before the war, between 1800 1860, that area. So you've got the first thing, covers some economic issues. The market revolution, okay? What we kind of, themed as the market revolution when we were studying this stuff back in the early part of not the early part, but about the middle of the fall semester. So you've got industrial America. Why not until the 1800s? Why was industrialization going on in the 1700s already in England and Germany, and it wasn't going on in America? What was America doing? What were we busy doing that we didn't need to industrialize? Farming, man. We had land. We had bukus of land. There was no need for industrialization. We were still getting everything from all of our manufactured goods from Europe. And people were coming here for the land. That's one thing that we had. Unlimited quantities of land, just, out there everywhere. So we had tons of that stuff. The irony of ironies, though, guys, is that, remember, Jefferson was he was the land guy. He was the whole reason that, his reasoning behind Louisiana Purchase is he wanted to make sure that there was going to be plenty of acreage in store for the future so that we could all be citizen farmers. Because he didn't like banks and business and federal government and all that stuff. I know this may sound goofy, but that's what Jefferson believed was going to make us the most democratic and the least corrupt. And he's not totally incorrect because as we're going to see as the century goes on, we're going to get to a time period where there's going to be massive corruption and huge separations of wealth and in the country. So anyway, Jefferson believes that we need this farmland. The irony, though, is that industrialization comes pretty much at his bequest because of the embargo, the War of 1812. Trying to keep us out of these wars, Jefferson enacts the embargo. We can no longer get manufactured goods from Britain, so we have to produce our own. So, unintended consequences, right? Jefferson had no way of knowing, just like he had no way of knowing that his Virginia and Kentucky resolutions were going to end up being used as a pretext for the South to secede. He's also going to be the guy that's going to be more instrumental in creating our own economic manufacturing base in New England. Eli Whitney. I once had a student write an essay, Eli Whitney caused the Civil War. Well, you could make a case for that, and he did a pretty good job, too, because Eli Whitney is going to be involved in not only bringing back what was starting to be a dying industry, cotton, by inventing the cotton gin, but then he's also going to be instrumental in the North and their industrialization and their ability to, replace weapons on the battlefield that the South aren't going to be able to do with interchangeable parts and everything, okay? So Eli Whitney, cotton gin, interchangeable parts, caused the Civil War. I think that's a stretch, but you see where we're going with this, okay? Agricultural revolution, the McCormick Reaper. Now one person and a couple of horses or mules could do what used to take 5 or 6 people weeks to do, they could do in a couple of days as far as harvesting. All right, who invented the steel plow? Who has the patent for the steel plow? You guys should know this. John Deere. Yeah, some of you guys probably have riding lawnmowers in your palatial Murphy estates that have John Deere on them, right? The green ones. Yes. No palatial Murphy Estates?
I live west side.
Huh?
I live out in West Plato.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's even worse. Willow Bend. Excuse me. I tease. Transportation. Slow at first, it's not necessary, but you start getting turnpikes, you get roads, and the Erie Canal is instrumental. The thing about the Erie Canal that's so unique is that this was not funded by the federal government. Who funded the Erie Canal? The state of New York. Okay? And why was the Erie Canal so instrumental? What did you now give, what did you now connect?
The Midwest.
With the Pacific Ocean.
Yeah.
Because you could sail up the Hudson River to the Erie Canal, and then you had access to the Erie Canal all the way to the Great Lakes, which gave you access to the Ohio River Valley and eventually the Mississippi. You know, instant transportation route there, 24/7, except in the winter. But ultimately, guys, what I tried to tell my classes when we were doing this, transportation comes down to one thing in the 19th century. It's going to be everything. It's not just going to be moving goods and services and people. It's going to make the country, it's going to bring democracy to the West. What are we talking about? Airlines? No!
Trains.
Railroads! Yes, railroads. You have to understand the importance of railroads. I know, they seem like relics of the past now, you know, and they're just irritating because they cross in front, you're trying to come back from Jimmy John's at lunch, and there's a damn train there, and you're like, oh, this is, great, I'm gonna be late for fifth period now because of this stupid train. Well, you can't underestimate the importance of trains in the 19th and early 20th century. You just can't. And it's not, like I said, it's not just transportation. It really brought the country west. It brought democracy west. And it was very democratic. Anybody could ride the trains. They operated 24/7, and they were democratic. You didn't have to be wealthy. You know, you didn't have to have money like you did sometimes to ride on a clipper ship or something like that. You could get on the train for next to nothing, and instantaneously, you know, you were within days you had access to the West. Cities like New York, Chicago, Philadelphia became more important than the old cities like New Orleans and Charleston, because they became the centers of trade, transportation, and especially Chicago. Chicago, if you guys have ever been to Chicago, you know, back in the days when trains were king, that was like the kind of central location where all the trackage, you know, that connected with the big cities on the East Coast, then connected with other cities in the West, like St. Louis and Kansas City and farther and farther. Chicago was the big thing. Old immigration. Old immigrants. Are they old people like me? Old immigrants? I'm an old immigrant. No, they're not old in that way. They're called old immigration because there's two big waves of immigration. Old immigrants and new immigrants. Old immigrants, 1830s, 1840s. What part of Europe are these people coming from?
Germany, Ireland.
North and West. Germany and Ireland. Most of them are well, the Germans are, you know, they value education, they adapt quickly. The Irish have a little bit of difficulty adapting, but they do speak the language. So the early immigrants, the old immigrants, that's going to be a little bit easier of a integration than the late immigrants or the newer immigrants around the turn of the century, which are going to come from Southern and Eastern Europe. And they're going to be Jews, and they're going to be Catholics, and they're going to have different languages, and they're going to be, you know, different. But there is still going to be nativism. Anytime, any new guy that comes to town, you know how this works. It still happens now in this day and age. You know, we've got a presidential administration that's going to build a wall because we want to keep out those immigrants, because they're taking our jobs and destroying our way of life. Well, they've been taking our jobs and destroying our way of life for 230 years, and it hasn't really hurt us. you know, but everybody thinks the new group coming to town somehow is going to make us less American or whatever. So you've got this nativism, this response. Do you guys know what NINA is an acronym for?
No Irish need apply.
Yes, no Irish need apply. I'm Irish. I would be at the low end of the totem pole in the 1830s or 40s, just barely above slaves. Barely. The Irish. We don't want the Irish. All they've brought to society is pretty much drinking and fighting. That's what I've been able to figure out anyway. So I'm kidding a little bit, but not too much. The Lowell girls, the Lowell, Massachusetts girls, and the beginning of wage slaves. Why are these young girls, single young girls, unable to live on their own in the 19th century? They're just not. It's unheard of. They have to, if a young girl out of high school or out of school is not married, she has to either live with a family or live with other people in like a communal situation. To live by herself would be unheard of. That would be unseemly, untoward. It wouldn't happen. Even young school teachers that were educated, when they came to these new towns in the West and the Midwest, they had to board with a family. They had to stay with somebody, or they had to, with a minister or something. They weren't allowed to live by themselves. Women had no rights. They didn't even have rights to their children in a divorce, which is totally flip-flop now compared to, the way it is now. So this is going to lead us into social issues and reform. Okay, all of these issues, but I'm going to talk about these individually, like the Second Great Awakening, Transcendentalism, middle class, Jefferson, Industrial Revolution, women. All of these things grow out of two things that happen, two simultaneous movements that kind of merge at the same time in the 1820s, 1830s. And that is the Second Great Awakening, this return to religious fervor and revivalism and fundamentalism, and that man can make himself better and more pure and more godlike, I guess, and transcendentalism, which, I love transcendentalism because it's so abstract and it's so, unique in that time period. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, this idea that man and nature are connected, that God is in everything. There's this oversoul, and we're all connected. And we can make ourselves better and thusly make the world better. It's very optimistic. Transcendentalism. It's the genesis for the women's movement, for abolitionism, the utopian communities, all of the reform movements that begin in the 1820s and 1830s, 40s, up through the Civil War, have their origins in transcendentalism and the Second Great Awakening. The one thing that the Second Great Awakening did, as far as also being a unifying force like the First Great Awakening was it solidified two faiths as the dominant Protestant faiths in the United States of America, which are still the two dominant Protestant faiths in the United States of America. What are we talking about?
Baptism.
Baptists and Methodists. Baptist and Methodist, as far as Protestant denominations, okay? Those become the dominant Protestant denominations as a result of the Second Great Awakening, and still are to this day in terms of numbers, membership in Protestant churches. They're huge. So you got transcendentalism, you've got the Second Great Awakening. Out of this growth of perfecting man and making life better and more, dealing with more perfection, you get these utopian communities. Unfortunately, most of these utopian communities are not going to be successful. They're not going to work. Why? Because they're dealing with human beings. When you're talking about human beings and perfection, good luck with that, right? One of these communities, I don't remember which one it was, because this isn't really my claim to fame. I think it might have been Brook Farm. The people there believed in celibacy. They believed in no sex. So after about 20, 30 years, they died out. right? And there was nobody to take over the business of, because they didn't. It's kind of necessary. So yeah, I mean, they didn't work out. But we do have some lasting remnants as far as, Shakers and the Oneidas and stuff like that. But human perfection, it's going to be difficult to do. All right, education. Education becomes much more standardized in the 1830s, 1840s, up to 1860. You've now only got not just education in New England and parts of the old Northwest Territory, but spreading throughout the country. It's becoming more standardized, and you start seeing high schools for the first time. Most education ended at what was called grammar school then, which would have been like a 5th or a 6th grade education, right? Reading, writing, arithmetic, basic math skills, and that was it. Then you went to work on the farm or in a factory or something. High schools don't become a thing until, later on, towards the Civil War, when it is becoming apparent that this new industrialized modern society that we're developing into is going to require a workforce that has a little bit more education. Just like in the 20th century, we at the beginning of the 20th century, guys, the number of people that went to college and graduated with 4-year degrees or master's degrees was, infinitesimal compared to what it is now. People graduated from high school and they were like, yay, we graduated from high school. My parents' generation, they were like the first ones to go to college in the family and everything, because everybody before them worked in factory jobs in the old Rust Belt. And they didn't need college educations. That's what high school becomes. McGuffey Reader becomes kind of the standardized reader. And it taught civics. That's something that we don't teach in school anymore. We teach history and we teach government and economics, but we don't teach what it means to be a citizen. That's what civics is. How, morality, patriotism, all of that corny, goofy stuff that, we don't want to talk about anymore. Maybe there's some connection between low voter turnout, these incredibly low voter turnouts we have, and the fact we don't teach civics and how the government works and your responsibility as a citizen and all that stuff anymore. Horace Mann, the father of public education. This is where you come in with tax-supported teacher education, schools, colleges that were specifically designed to teach teachers, education schools, okay? Noah Webster's the dictionary guy, and then you got Emma Hart Willard and Mary Lyons start talking about, hey, here's something else I'll bet you didn't know. You know that colleges and universities were segregated by race, right? And that if you wanted to go to a university as a freedman, a free black person, you usually had to go to a black university. Well, it was the same thing for women. Most universities in the 19th century did not accept women, so women's colleges and universities started to spring up. Oberlin, Wellesley, a lot of the kind of pretty prestigious schools right now sprang up to meet the demand for women that wanted to go to college for the first time, because a lot of schools, not until even into the 20th century. I can remember when I was a kid and we went to Notre Dame games, and the cheerleaders for Notre Dame were from St. Mary's, which was the Catholic version of Notre Dame for girls, because Notre Dame was only boys. This was in the 1960s.
It's on the other side of the lake.
Yeah, St. Mary's. That was in the 1960s. So that's something that is relatively recent. The last section, well, next to last section that I want to talk about is this is the women's movement. It goes directly back to the Second Great Awakening and Transcendentalism. This idea of perfection, of reform, begins with the women's movement early on. And women are going to take the lead in the reform movements. And actually, of course, when abolitionism comes along in the 1850s and late 1840s, they're going to shelve, their demands for the vote, for women's rights and all that stuff, and actually work towards abolitionism. So there's going to be a bit of a delay there during the 1850s and through the Civil War. But when the Civil War is over, we're going to switch back to the women's movement, which is actually going to ultimately result in the 19th Amendment in 1920, and the women getting the right to vote. But you guys need to be familiar with this term, cult of domesticity. You're going to see this on the AP exam, I guarantee you, because it keeps popping up, and it pops up again in the 1950s. After the war, the men come home from the war, they go back to work, the women are now no longer needed in the factories, and they're expected to go back to the home and make cookies and have dinner ready and have children. The cult of domesticity. It's going to be the last time, pretty much, that we see the cult of domesticity for a while, because by the 1960s, we'll have the modern women's movement, and the birth control pill and all that stuff is going to change our culture, and for the better, okay? You need to be familiar with the Seneca Falls Convention and the Declaration of Sentiments. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. This is the kind of the benchmark beginning of the organized women's movement, okay? And they use the Declaration of Independence as a template. And they, in their Declaration of Sentiments, they use, Jefferson's words, except where it says all men are created equal, they add all men and women are created equal. Like I said, by the 1850s, the women's movement is going to take a back seat to abolitionism. That's going to become the reform movement of the time. Dorothea Dix was a woman that fought for reforms in the treatment of the mentally ill, okay? You can imagine mentally ill people that were considered to be insane were usually just warehoused, locked up, no treatment, nothing. It was very archaic. The Grimke sisters, abolitionists, Susan B. Anthony, women's rights, Lucy Stone. The followers of Lucy Stone were called the Lucy Stoners. And once again, this has nothing to do with smoking doobies in the parking lot. What did the Lucy Stoners believe? They were radical back then. You guys remember?
The axes, right?
Huh?
Are they the one with the axes, like?
No, that was Carrie Nation.
Contraception.
No, that was Margaret Sanger. Lucy Stoners believed that women should keep their maiden names when they got married. How dare they keep their maiden names? Well, nowadays, that's pretty much, not everybody does it, but it's standard operating procedure. My daughter got married a year ago. She's still Erin Connor, even though she's married to Anthony Savard. She just kept her name. And we were like, okay, doesn't matter to us, but that's not uncommon anymore. Like I said, women moved valiantly into abolitionism in the 1850s, and abolitionism would become the reform movement of that decade, about a decade, maybe 10, 15 years prior to the Civil War. You need to be familiar with William Lloyd Garrison. He published a newspaper, a periodical called The Liberator. This guy was very radical. He was so radical that when the South started talking about secession, he was like, fine, go, let them go. They're evil. They're a sin against humanity, a crime against humanity, the slave owners and everything. Well, obviously that's not going to happen. Frederick Douglass was very influential. Here's a former slave, self-educated, very eloquent, became in high demand in speaking engagements for abolitionist conventions and all over the country. People wanted to hear Frederick Douglass speak because he brought some legitimacy to the abolitionist movement. He wasn't just some white guy from Massachusetts that had never been to the South. He was a former slave. Theodore Weld wrote a book called Slavery as It Is. It says, who read this? Mostly people in the North. People in the South are not gonna read this, just like people in the South are not gonna read Uncle Tom's Cabin, which we'll talk about Thursday when we do Causes of the Civil War. You know, that's gonna be something they're not gonna be involved in. And then the last little section here, besides the abolitionists, is, because we're talking about American society, in the first half of the 19th century, the birth of American arts, okay? The Hudson River School, the landscape paintings, James Fenimore Cooper, he wrote Last of the Mohicans. Washington Irving wrote, you know, Legend of Sleepy Hollow. For the first time, you not only have an American political entity, but you have an American cultural and artistic entity. We no longer have to go to Europe for our art and our literature. You have something that is uniquely American in scope and you know, breadth and depth, everything. I mean, you know, especially with the landscape paintings of the Hudson River School, they were used as propaganda. You know, all of these Thomas Cole and Bierstadt paintings, you know, show these majestic, you know, western landscapes with waterfalls and mountains, and they were dark on one side and they got light, you know. It showed kind of the whole thing with nature and everything. But you can still see a bunch of those if you guys go to the Amon Carter. You guys ever been to the Amon Carter? It's in Fort Worth and it's free. And it's American art. They have Thomas Cole's, they have Bierstadts, they have Edward Hopper's, they got all kinds of stuff there. It's not.
I went when I was like 8.
Oh.
My parents dragged me.
They dragged you.
Yeah.
You're going to a museum so you can get some culture. I know that's what my parents used to do to me when I was in high school, because I wanted to go to a Black Sabbath concert, and they wanted to take me to like plays at the Kennedy Center and stuff. I was like, oh, the Kennedy Center. And now I'm glad they did that, because you know that was pretty cool at the time. Anyway, I'm done. If you have any questions, let me know. Take the handout and